Hi, everyone. I'm Gary Brode from Deep Knowledge Investing. We provide actionable investment ideas and timely market commentary to hedge funds, family offices, registered investment advisors, and individual investors. We help people get better returns. Today, we are coming to you live from Cusco, Peru. It's 12,500 feet, so if I sound out of breath or say stupid things, it's really just because there's a lack of oxygen here. So lack of oxygen to the brain is my excuse for everything today. We are really excited to welcome fellow member of the Deep Knowledge Investing Board of Advisors, Heather Heldman. Heather was formerly with the United States State Department. She worked at The Hague and is one of the managing partners and founders of Luminae Group, which does international political risk consulting. Heather is an expert in the Middle East, Russia, China, terrorism, and in their spare time, they assist the U.S. government with hostage negotiation and rescue. Obviously, you can tell this is why we wanted her on the call today. And Heather, 1 second before we turn it over to you, I just want to welcome all the people who are actually on this call from here in Peru. And also, I see we have some people from Denmark and, of course, New York in the United States. Great to see all of you. Thanks for making the time. Heather, great to see you. Thanks for making the time.
Gary, thanks for having me. It's great to be back and to be doing another webinar, though I wish it were under different circumstances.
Right. And this is a tough one to be talking about. And I think the first thing we want to tell people is we have a great deal of sympathy for the people in Ukraine. But today we are going to be talking about the economic and political aspects of this. And it's our job to help people understand it. And I think it's important to point that out. What do you think, Heather?
Yeah, I'm very excited to talk about what the current situation means for U.S. strategic interests, both right now and in the future. I'm happy to take questions toward the end of the call, but let's just kick it off with the first question, Gary.
All right, great. And by the way, for everyone in the audience, if you have questions for Heather at any point, Guru is monitoring the call. Please send him, use the chat feature, send Guru a message, and he'll forward it on to me. And we can absolutely accommodate your questions on the call. So Heather, first question for you. What happens in Ukraine? Is this something that's over in a week? Does this become a 10-year kind of thing like the Russians in Afghanistan and later the United States in Afghanistan? Can the Ukrainians hold out? Does this become a long-term civil war? What do you see as the future here?
So, let's start with the good news first. This is not going to go on for 10 years, but it's certainly going to go on for more than a few days, more than a few weeks. We're probably looking at a few months to a few years of active fighting. Now, I am deeply hopeful that we're looking at weeks or months and not years. But I actually think the next couple days are going to be very decisive. And the key question in my mind is how quickly is the situation with the siege of Ukrainian cities able to be resolved? So I don't think that there is a foregone conclusion that Russians will be able to take Kyiv and Kharkiv. It's not looking good today, but I do think that the situation is still sufficiently dynamic that the tide could turn in the Ukrainian favor. But what happens to those key cities is going to be, I think, really determinative of what happens long term. So if the Ukrainians are able to rally and either disrupt the convoys that are currently en route to Kyiv and Kharkiv and elsewhere around the country, or otherwise sort of disrupt these sort of sieges that are clearly set in motion, I think that really is going to be the biggest sort of breath of fresh air and the biggest opening for the Ukrainians. If the Russians do indeed take these cities, then we're looking at a very different scenario where the sort of pressure on a Ukrainian insurgency is going to be ratcheted up significantly. I do think that if that happens, there will be ample international support for such an insurgency. It could turn into a long-term issue, but I sincerely hope that we don't get there. I don't think that anyone has either the appetite or frankly the resources for a long-term insurgency, and by that I mean, you know, sort of more than 1 or 2 years. I am cautiously optimistic that there is no appetite for allowing that type of situation to persist in Europe for such a period of time. I also think that Russian military resources, you know, are going to be stretched quite thin sooner rather than later. The Russian regulars, I think, are sort of not committed in terms of their, you know, hearts and minds, and that factor should not be underestimated. There's certainly a very large reliance on sort of paramilitary contractors like the Wagner Group. That's an element of the Russian attack strategy that I don't think is discussed sufficiently. I certainly can foresee a situation in which the deployment of those types of forces from elsewhere around the planet is pulled back and those resources directed into Ukraine. But I, you know, to sort of keep it short for today, I would say, you know, buckle up and hold on for a number of weeks or months, but hopefully not a year or longer.
Okay, well, I've got to tell you, Heather, just the fact that you're talking about a period of maybe a couple of months to 1 or 2 years at the longest makes you more clear and more specific on that particular point than anyone else I've read all week. Let me
clarity here.
You really have it. Let me ask you 2 questions about this. One, where do you think we end up on this? Does Ukraine remain an independent country under the control of the Ukrainian citizens, or does it become basically a Soviet client state? And then the second question is, I think people have been surprised by the fact that the Russians haven't made more progress. Is that because, as you said, the Russian regulars may not have their hearts and minds in it, or because the Ukrainian resistance has just been a lot more dedicated than people had anticipated, and better armed as well?
Okay, so I'm going to address the second question first because the answer is shorter. So I think, first of all, the Ukrainian resistance was largely underestimated. And I think that is a result, frankly, of a lot of Western populations and their respective governments becoming lazy and losing touch with their own historical narratives. I've thought a lot about the US, you know, Revolutionary War this week. I've thought a lot about the Israeli War for Independence this week. I've thought a lot about Britain and France during World War II. And, you know, I'm a nerd, I'm a history buff, I do geopolitics for a living. So all of these examples are going to be, you know, fresher and I think, you know, maybe more easily graspable for someone in my position. But, you know, it's very important that I think Western leaders really draw upon those narratives when they're communicating with their populations to communicate the gravity of the situation in Ukraine. And, you know, when your freedom is under siege, you will fight. This is, you know, something that seems a very remote concept to most Americans today, but it's really only, you know, 200 and something years, you know, behind us. So I think that, you know, we all need to tip our hats to the Ukrainians. You know, morally, we need to be behind them. I do think that they were underestimated, but I don't know how long they can hold out. The Russian component of that, you know, the flip side of that question is, you know, Russia today is a lot of smoke and mirrors. And that concept is true when we're talking about Russian military might as well. Yes, in some ways, it's a very sophisticated global leader when it comes to being able to establish and maintain military superiority in various theaters. Yes, they have access to an arsenal of very sophisticated weapons, including cyber weapons. But, the country itself is diverse, diffuse, and not in a good place economically. So you have a lot of power concentrated at the top, and you have a lot of influence concentrated at the top, and you have, these sort of centers of power that are able to move around in, the leading global circles and sort of throw their weight around in a way that makes it seem as if all of Russia is united. But, much of Russia is a impoverished backwater, to be blunt about it. And a lot of the Russian population doesn't even have access to accurate news about what's going on in the world. So, you're dealing with a lot of people whose primary concern is securing food and housing. They're not really interested in engaging in an ideological vacation south of the border.
Hi, baby.
So I don't think that this is really this experiment or this invasion that Putin has carried out, I think is really going to reveal a lot of weaknesses in the Russian system writ large. And as a geostrategist, I'm not particularly surprised by what is coming to bear. So Gary, sorry for the long-winded answer. Please go back and repeat the first question.
I will, but you know what, Heather? I just want to point out one of the reasons I love talking to you about these things is because in one explanation, you really talked about several hundred years of history. Everybody right now is looking at what's the news today, what's happened in the last 3 hours. And you're looking at hundreds of years of insurgencies and people fighting for their freedom. And certainly pointing out that in terms of incentives, the incentives on the Ukrainian side are very different than the incentives on the Russian side. And the Russian soldiers and citizens who supposedly would be behind this, Putin may not have as much support from his own people, whether that's the military or his own citizens, as the Ukrainians do on their side. And while everybody's looking at what's happened in the last couple of hours, you're looking at hundreds of years of history here, and I think that's instructive.
That's why I'm here.
Yeah. So the first question on that, the first part of it really is: Are you surprised? Oh no, actually, it was. Where do you think this ends up? Right? Does Ukraine maintain their independence, or do they become essentially the next Soviet client, the Soviet Union too?
So it's probably going to be a combination of both of those potential outcomes. And again, a lot of it is going to, the contours of how the cookie will crumble at the end of the day, a lot of that is going to depend upon what happens in the next couple days and weeks with respect to the seizure of major cities. So I feel for President Zelensky, and I personally admire his commitment to staying in Kyiv and, saying that he's going to, be there till the end. But the strategist in me has been thinking for several days now that a intact government in exile that can function, if need be, from over the border in Poland is actually a lot more valuable in the long term than the political sort of points that he could gain by staying in Kyiv. I would strongly urge him, frankly, quite soon, to think about at least moving to Lviv and bringing with him his top advisors, because what I want to see as someone who is not only interested in the preservation of the Ukrainian state, but also US strategic interests over the course of the coming weeks, months, and years is continuity in a democratically elected government of Ukraine. Whether that government is sitting in Kyiv, Lviv, Warsaw, or London, or even New York, if need be, doesn't really matter to me. But the governmental continuity is critical. So that's one issue. If there is government continuity, regardless of how it shakes out and where it shakes out, even if it has to be a government in exile temporarily, if there is government continuity, I think there will be no difficulty in maintaining Ukraine as an independent democratic nation that is squarely in an adversarial posture toward Russia. And that doesn't mean active fighting, but that means that it has clearly and permanently aligned itself with democratic forces in the West. I think the application to the EU, which was expedited earlier this week, is a positive step in that direction. And I think that process will be completed in fairly short order, but obviously the implementation of such an integration is going to take much longer. If Zelensky does not survive, then we're faced with a much more complicated scenario. It's still possible to have government continuity, though I am not at this juncture intimately familiar with the chain of succession plans in Ukraine. I'm sure they exist. So again, you could have continuity with potentially a different leader, and that's still like a decent plan B. If there is a total breakdown in government, I think that's where the US should be very concerned, along with our European allies, about Ukraine just sort of becoming I would call it an ungoverned space for a period of years or decades, because there will be a resistance, but then the resistance has to organize, and some faction of the resistance has to receive international recognition in order to continuously get cohesive and frankly meaningful international support, not just militarily, but also diplomatically. All of the pieces of the puzzle are very important. I do think that going back to, sort of the ideal scenarios, A and B, either Zelensky survives or the government survives, but it's not Zelensky. There may be a settlement in which portions of what is currently Ukraine, and I think it's really the areas that are currently that were previously under Russian control, are more or less ceded to Russia as some part of a settlement, and a demilitarized zone is created and somehow patrolled by international forces. But I don't think that that's an ideal scenario. It's not something that I want to see happen, but I do think that it is a reasonable compromise that could be floated as a face-saving move for both sides of the conflict at this juncture, and it may be the sort of linchpin that enables a ceasefire.
All right, so before we move, I want to move on and talk about sanctions, but before we do that, always the historian, Heather, it sounds like what you favor is more of the Dalai Lama's approach, right? Government in exile, survive and have a recognized head of state somewhere, as opposed to, if we go back to World War II, where the Queen of England and the King, they kept their children in London and didn't flee, basically as a way of saying, we're in it with you. We're not going to protect ourselves at the people's expense.
Well, there's no good way out for Zelensky. I think that he is demonstrating himself to be a sufficiently adept leader to be able to communicate to his people the urgency of preservation if the need arises. The first step is not going from Kyiv to Warsaw. The first step is going from Kyiv to Lviv. And, I do think that the Ukrainian population is sophisticated enough to appreciate the need to move and the need for governmental preservation. You know, we don't have a lot of French people today telling de Gaulle that, his rationale was insane and how dare he. It's quite the opposite. So, it is a political calculus. I think, it's a little bit different to say, to compare Zelensky to the Queen, who is ultimately a political figurehead. I mean, Zelensky isn't a key operational figure. He needs to be able to function. He needs to be able to make decisions. If he is isolated in a bunker and doesn't have sufficient room to maneuver, and his communication to, other world leaders is potentially cut off, he's not going to be maximally effective as the strategic thinker that his people need him to be.
Fair enough. Okay, so Heather, let's move on to sanctions. What do you think about the sanctions that have been imposed by the West? Have they been the right ones, wrong? Do you think they'll be effective? What happens here?
So I have been saying for several months that the US has become entirely over-reliant on sanctions as both a first and last line of both defense and offense. So, to be frank about it, I'm not impressed with the sanctions that have been levied so far, not because I think they're ineffective, but because I think they're poorly timed. The time to levy sanctions is not when the fighting started. The time to levy sanctions was when the troops were amassing on the border, and US intelligence, to its credit, got it correct. So the call was correct. Putin is lining up forces. This is what's going to happen. Now, Europeans did not want to buy that narrative, and that's an entirely different conversation. But the US intelligence community got it correct in terms of predicting what Vladimir Putin was intending to do with his military buildup. The sanctions would have been more effective if they had been levied when we went from, say, 10,000 troops to 100,000 troops, because the goal was not to, punish Vladimir Putin now. He is going full bore. He's not going to stop. He's not going to be moved by the imposition of one more economic sanction at this juncture. The time for sanctions, in my opinion, was several weeks ago before any fighting started, to say, listen, we see what's going on. It's not acceptable. It is not acceptable, and we will hurt your economy now. So your ability to take further preparatory action is limited. Full stop. Now, I don't know to what extent the Biden administration actually tried to advance that strategy. I know that there were a lot of conversations with, our European allies between then and now. The other, sort of downside of sanctions is that they're not effective unless they're collective. So you're really testing the bounds of international cooperation here. Is it better late than never? Probably, but I also think that if you really want to, put the nail in the coffin on the Russian economy, there's a lot more that you can do. I'm glad that Germany has finally rallied to the cause and is taking steps with respect to, turning off the Russian gas spigot, but it's almost too little too late. I mean, when Kyiv is being shelled, sanctions are not sufficient.
Right. At this point, if Putin were to back up, it would be a loss of face that would probably cost him his position. So you're right. For sanctions to be effective, they would have needed to be levied at a point where Putin could still take a step back.
Right. Now, the other issue that I think has been underappreciated here is the extent to which, economies, particularly the economies of quasi-illegitimate states, of which Russia, I think, can qualify under certain metrics, can become sort of sanctions, not sanctions proof, but sanctions resilient. when we're dealing with an economy like the United States or the UK or Germany or France, we have a different set of standards when it comes to how cleanly things should be operating and how smoothly things should be operating. If you look at an economy like China or Iran or Myanmar or North Korea, people find a way. So to sort of think that sanctions alone are going to sufficiently deter or change Russian behavior is frankly wishful thinking. It's very naive. There are just too many loopholes, particularly with the growing avenues of financial exchange created by cryptocurrencies and all other types of sort of not mainstream financial exchanges that are available through various, online marketplaces to keep it simple. I just don't think that sanctions, here are a panacea. They never were. They should have never been cast as that, and they're not going to enable a clean way out of this.
So what's the alternative though? Because look, you've been right on the sanctions, but what's the alternative? It's in the U.S. Army. We can't go to war with Russia in Europe. The possibility of escalation there is insane.
The possibility of escalation is insane, and nobody wants to see a nuclear war break out between the United States and Russia. No one wants to see the European continent further, enveloped in conflict at this point in time. I feel compelled to say, for the record, that it was a mistake to announce ahead of time that US troops will not be participating on the ground in Ukraine. That is a valid policy aspiration, and it's a valid policy to implement, but it's not a valid policy to announce, because you can't essentially play a game of poker by holding all of your cards out before the game begins. This is simply not how things work. And I think that making that announcement really gave Putin the sort of wind beneath his sail that he was searching for, to say, okay, I'm not going to be constrained here. There has to be a credible threat of intervention at all times. This can be, I think in this context, most likely NATO. But I think now, sort of given the way the chessboard is set up and given the vocalized policy desires of President Biden and his many European counterparts, the most likely scenario is going to be a heavy flow of weapons and other types of strategic support that flows across the border, most likely from Poland, maybe from a few other European countries that are neighboring. And there needs to be a lot of intelligence support. Now, how that is delivered is, again, sort of a conversation that's deeper than what we're going to have today. But on that token, I want to emphasize that right now, the most important sort of conduit for information really needs to be what the US and Western allies can get from Russia, because the most important thing here in determining a path forward is not necessarily looking at, what is needed from a military perspective to improve the situation on the ground in Ukraine. Yes, that is needed, but what's really going to determine sort of where the US and its allies are able to go with Russia is Putin's psychology. So the human intelligence that the United States and its allies should be trying to extract, and I'm sure are trying to extract out of Moscow at this point in time, is what's critical. I think ultimately a lot of this is due to an unwillingness to sort of read Putin for the man that he's become, or just an underappreciation of the sort of individual psychology of foreign relations. And I think a lot of U.S. leaders, I don't place blame, individually on Biden here by any stretch of the imagination. I think there's been a lot of wishful thinking in the U.S.-Russia relationship for many decades, and it's time to stop. If you're not going to stop that now, I don't know when.
There's no question that Vladimir Putin has been very clear for decades about the kind of person he is, and he has been misunderstood by politicians in the United States of both parties, and regularly. And I think it's the wishful thinking you're talking about. Let me go back to the point you were making a minute ago, where you were talking about the possibility of nuclear weapons being involved. Last week, Putin was talking about a response unlike any the world has ever seen. As I was preparing for this call, I saw a headline that one of the Russian ministers talked openly about how World War III will be fought with nuclear weapons. And we have a question from Jason Gans. Any chance of Russia using nuclear weapons? It's a good question under the circumstances. Let me rephrase Jason's question. Any chance of anyone using nuclear weapons here?
I think the likelihood of a power that supports Ukraine using nuclear weapons is very, very low. I don't want to say it's zero because it's not, but I think it's very, very low, to the extent that I would not put it on the table as a reasonable policy option at this juncture. However, I do think that there is a real risk. Now, I think it's a less than 50% risk, but it is a real risk that Putin will engage in some type of nuclear weapon use at some point in time. Do I think that he's going to, quote unquote, launch a big one? No. He's going to do something that sort of provokes a small response. It's going to be something that is meant to kind of feel out what the West is willing to do. I would liken this to the Assad's regime's use of chemical weapons in Syria a couple years ago, to sort of see what type of response is this going to elicit, from the powers that are, that were at the time, really pushing for regime change in Syria, and that were trying to bring an end to the civil war there. He learned that he could frankly get away with it. Now, that didn't lead to the level of chemical weapon use that I guess, would launch World War III in the Middle East. And I don't think that Putin is suicidal. And for that reason, I don't think that he's going to use a level of force that would, essentially lead to Moscow and St. Petersburg being wiped off the map. But is he going to poke and prod and potentially use nuclear weapons to kind of figure out where the line is? He might, and that's a real possibility. Again, I think it's a less than 50% probability, but if I were sitting in the Situation Room, I would absolutely be preparing for that potential scenario.
So what, at this point in 2022, what does a small nuclear event look like, and where would Putin target?
So I'm going to preface the answer to this question by saying I am not an expert on nuclear arms. So I don't want to say too much about physically, what this would look like. But I do think that, the most likely target is somewhere in Ukraine, probably in the center of the country, because there's not a lot of interest on the part of Russia in destroying or causing significant damage to one of the western portions of the country that is sorry, I got that mixed up. It's most likely going to be in the western part of the country because there is not an appetite on the part of Putin to cause an enormous amount of damage in the eastern part of the country, where there are, allegedly these Russian-speaking, Russian aligned populations. So, he's not dumb enough to routinely shoot himself in the foot. I think when it comes to, targeting. And I do think that I'm cautiously optimistic again, would exercise some degree of restraint in terms of not outright targeting a NATO member country, because that has an assured response. But he will tiptoe right up to the line. So, for people living in Western Ukraine, probably central to Western Ukraine, because you want to create a sufficient radius where maybe the fallout is not guaranteed to cross the Ukrainian border. That's where I'd be most concerned about right now.
Okay. You brought up China earlier. What's their view on all this? How does this play out? What are they thinking?
So I think China is watching this, through two different lenses. The first lens is, through China's own sort of foreign policy objectives, and that is largely, those are objectives that have largely been pursued through a policy of non-intervention. So I think, largely, when we look at it from that angle, Xi Jinping is probably cringing a little bit, because this is not the type of endeavor that he wishes to entangle himself or his country in. China definitely prefers a non-interventionist type of foreign policy, where it will sort of go anywhere and do anything to promote its economic interests. In a few arenas, it will, advance its military interests as well, though it is very much still in a ground-laying stage with respect to its military presence. So I don't think that China is really going to kind of stick its neck out for Putin here. I also don't think it's going to do anything to try to bring the fighting to an end. When you get that far west of mainland China, the policy is non-intervention, and the policy is market access. But the other lens through which China is looking at this is very much from a strategic one with respect to Taiwan. And the question that it's asking is, what is the West going to do? Now, on the one hand, it's a very apt comparison, because you have, in theory, if we look at this from Putin's perspective, territory in Ukraine that is of, disputed loyalty, and Russia believes that it has a legitimate claim on, and therefore is entitled to assert itself militarily to protect. The narrative with respect to China and Taiwan, from China's perspective, is nearly the same. So there's definitely an open question as to, if the West doesn't have an appetite to intervene in Ukraine, is it going to have an appetite to intervene in Taiwan either? In Ukraine, obviously, the European stake is much greater than the European stake in Taiwan. I think the Taiwan issue is very much a U.S. China debacle, the European powers have a far less vested interest in that, and I don't foresee a scenario in which that will change. What's different with Taiwan is that, you know, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, they all have a much greater strategic interest in what happens in Taiwan versus, you know, what happens in Ukraine. So, you know, there are US allies in both arenas, but that's another reason why I'm so frustrated by the Biden administration's announcement that it will not, you know, send troops to Ukraine, because you've exposed your hand before the game has been played. I think that a similar announcement, you know, aimed at Taiwan would be catastrophic and would basically, you know, be a green light to Xi to just move on the island tomorrow, and no one will lift a finger.
I agree with that. Why then? Because somebody in the Situation Room had to have gamed this out. Why do you think that they said so clearly, we're not going to send troops? Because you're 100% right. Not only did that give Vladimir Putin what he thought was the green light, China has to be looking at that and thinking, okay, well, maybe that'll apply to us as well. Maybe we can get that assurance and just sort of walk across or you know, send some boats across and take Taiwan.
So, you know, I don't want to place a lot of blame on the Biden administration, because I'm not entirely sure that a different administration, either a different Democratic administration or even a Republican administration, would be managing the situation radically differently. But I do think that the calculation, and this was reflected in the State of the Union address last night, the calculation on the part of the current administration is that domestic politics are more important and more salient to the average American voter than international affairs. And on the one hand, it's a valid sentiment. But on the other hand, if you don't have a democracy, or your, you know, in your way of life is under siege, you know, the price of gas is irrelevant. So I think that you know, it's indicative of a larger need to change the tone of communication between whomever is in the White House and the American population. There has to be more strategic communication about why this matters, and it's appropriate to acknowledge, you know, that, you know, we pulled out of Afghanistan because keeping a large US troop presence there was no longer, you know, an optimal use of US strategic resources. You know, the troop presence was not going to change the historical narrative of that country any longer. And, you know, essentially the expiration date had arrived. But that's part of the story. That's not the entire story. And so, you know, you can talk all you want about wanting to end, you know, forever wars, but you know, wanting to end a forever war is not the same as saying war will be over forever. Absolutely not. The issue is the war in Afghanistan has come to a close. There are new and pressing, you know, threats to U.S. national security that will touch the lives of every single person in this country. We have a limited number of resources. They happen to be more resources than any other nation on the planet has, but they're still limited, and we need to deploy them differently. And, you know, every single person, you know, has a dog in this fight. Some are large, some are small. But it's the same problem. You know, why is TikTok still widely in use here? You know, no one wants to talk about how every time you use that program, you're you know, opening yourself up to the Chinese government. So, you know, I think that it's high time to recognize that, you know, that we're sort of living one of the downsides of globalization right now. You know, I think that really since the 1990s, there was a sense that, you know, the US is never going to be dragged into an international military conflict that is, you know, in any way existential ever again, because the Cold War had quote unquote ended. That's just not the case. And we were able to sort of grapple with that reality for a short period of time around 9/11, unfortunately, but we've got to continue realizing that the threat is never going to go away. It's going to evolve, and we cannot be lulled into this, sense of complacency. It's probably not, wise, and certainly not at this point, to have any sort of direct US military intervention in Ukraine. But it's also not wise to remove that option from the table, because you don't know what tomorrow is going to hold. And until you fully regain control of the narrative, which the US does not have right now, absolutely not, you're going to be in a responsive mode. And you're going to have to respond to the whims of China, Russia, others. So yes, we need to work on regaining control of the narrative, but in the meantime, you have to be prepared for any number of scenarios. And I think the president, regardless of his or her party, does have an obligation to prepare the population for such a scenario.
I want to come back to that point in just a minute. But let's finish up something we were just talking about in China and Taiwan. I think one of the things that's going to be more difficult for the United States there, besides the fact that, as you pointed out, we'd have a different set of allies, more Asian and Pacific allies, less from Western Europe. But I see two problems there. One is, in terms of sanctions, the United States disconnecting from the Chinese economy is very different from disconnecting from the Russian economy. And then separately from that, Jason Gans just chimed in with another question that I had, which is, besides the desire that any freedom-loving people have to see the people of Ukraine be able to chart their own destiny, the people of Taiwan be able to maintain their own independence, there's also a huge security issue there. Taiwan Semiconductor is the world's largest supplier of high-end chips. China gaining control of not only that technology, but the ability, that supply for the world, it's a game changer. And I agree with Jason, that's absolutely the right question to be asking. So we have two issues there. You want to address either or both of them?
Well, so I agree with you that, the ability to sanction Russia is different than the ability to sanction China. Now, I have been advising clients for years now to try to lighten their footprint in China precisely because of geopolitical concerns. I think, US companies are still largely too reactive and I think a bit lazy, frankly, when it comes to really wanting to do the hard work and the investments that are necessary to lighten the US commercial footprint in China, not in terms of goods going in, but in terms of goods coming out, in sort of diversifying the US supply chain and mitigating that dependence. Now on the and because of that, sanctioning China is really not a viable option. So we can have a whole nother webinar on US Chinese strategic relations, and I'm looking at the clock, and we only have around 10 minutes left, so I don't want to go too far down that road. But on the semiconductor issue, I think the US is moving in the right direction, though a little bit too slowly. So, the primary semiconductor producer in Taiwan, I think it's Taiwan Semiconductor. Yeah, is building a factory somewhere in the Southwest US, and I think it's Intel is also
in Ohio.
Yeah, so that that piece of the puzzle is being addressed. I think it needs to be accelerated, but it also needs to be accelerated in a way that, frankly, uses a little bit of deception. And I don't know to what degree that is happening. So, you want to proceed as if operations are going full stream ahead as normal in Taiwan, but in reality, you're moving away, and you're relocating your people and your technological resources out of Taiwan. One scenario that I foresee for Taiwan, and I think it's both, a way to preserve Taiwanese civilization and society, but at the same point in time, it's a sad, sort of reality to live with. Is, first of all, you have to accept the notion that the Taiwan as an island, its value is not in the land. The land is valuable to the Chinese, but it's not of any, international intrinsic value. In the same way that with Hong Kong, the land was only valuable because of the system that it supported. I'm aware that there are still very expensive real estate transactions going on in Hong Kong. I don't think they're smart, and I that's a whole nother conversation. But ultimately, the value of Taiwan is not in the land, it's in the system. So if China wants to launch, a full-scale invasion of the island and seize the island, that's great, but it's only of strategic value if the technology and the human resources remain there. If all of that is gone and has relocated, essentially in exile elsewhere in the US and South Korea and Japan, in another sort of, free and open society and economy, like, great, like, you've just dove after a pit of dirt. Congratulations. So that's a narrative, that's a scenario that I don't think is being grappled with sufficiently in Washington, because it's extreme, but everything about Xi Jinping is extreme. So I personally think it's appropriate.
Got it. All right. So Heather, I want to come back to the point that you were making before. You were talking about how the communication of the White House to the American people really needs to emphasize that there could be a cost for supporting international freedom. And then, in the notes that you and I shared before we started this call, you talked about something like that. You talked about how Gen Z in particular needs to have a different approach. I'm guessing that those two thoughts tie together, and would love to know more about what you think should be communicated.
Well, I do think that the Gen Z, has this reputation for being, sort of very me focused. It's all about, personal technology, sort of personal material comfort, maximum convenience, and a fairly isolationist stance when it comes to US involvement abroad. I think that, it's fair. You have to be fair to the average American who maybe doesn't have a large appetite for US military intervention abroad, given how the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan played out. Neither one were, particularly productive from the perspective of US strategic interests. But just because the last, I would say, 2 decades have not showcased American foreign policy backed by American military power, in its prime, doesn't mean that this is always going to be the case. And I think a lot of Gen Z doesn't have much of an appreciation for 20th century history, 20th century conflict, and has basically lived their entire lives in a state of peace, and certainly with the European continent in a more or less state of peace. Certainly, young people who grew up in the Balkans, have a very different perspective. But, the last 20 years in the US, despite the recession, have been a pretty cushy time in place. So I think we need to just kind of do a large scale reset in terms of, changing the conversation. There are a lot of legitimate domestic political issues that need attention, and some of them are civil rights based, some of them are economic, so on and so forth. These are all important, but they frankly are meaningless if there's no national security, because if you don't have, secure borders, what happens within those borders is second rate, to put it nicely. So I think that there really just needs, I have confidence in the American people. I think that if, leaders sort of step up and frankly do, what President Zelensky is doing, communicating with his people bluntly and honestly, and being, realistic about what's at stake and what the future may hold, the American people will rise to the occasion. This is ultimately a very patriotic population, but I think one that needs reminders every now and then about, despite the fact that there are flaws in our system, it's still the best thing going, and we need to remember that we are stronger when this system, or something that very closely approximates it, thrives in other environments as well. We can't sit here and talk about how great our democracy and our values are if we're unwilling to extend a hand, whether it's actual or proverbial, to someone else who is in the same situation, because we were there 200 and something odd years ago, and we can't forget it.
Heather, that's a great point. And like you, I share your confidence in the American people. For what it's worth, the interactions that I've had with members of Gen Z are the deep knowledge investing interns. And if anything would give you hope, it is that these people, these young people, are dedicated, driven, not so me focused. They have a great view of the world, very hardworking, no sense of entitlement. As I deal with them, as I interact with these people in their late teens and early 20s, I do see the possibility that the message that you're talking about will be well received, and that some of the negative stereotypes of Gen Z in particular may not hold up when we start to really look at them as individual people.
Well, I'm sure that's true, and you have, there are plenty of exceptions to every rule. But I want to sort of use the opportunity as a, also to say that this whole scenario, I think, points to a need to sort of change the way that foreign policy is taught in schools, to change the way that civics is taught in schools. There's not enough of it. And, I think anything that anyone who's on this call can do to engage, young people in what's going on in the world is time well spent.
All right, that's a great point. We are at the end of our time here. First, I'd like to thank the members of the audience for your great questions, your time and attention. Many members of the Deep Knowledge Investing Board of Advisors here. We have some people from Peru and, of course, some people from Denmark. Welcome. Thanks for being here. Very happy to be highlighting the knowledge and expertise today of managing partner of Luminae Group, Heather Heldman, also a member of the Deep Knowledge Investing Board of Advisors. Heather, always fascinating talking to you, and so glad we had the chance to get your point of view on these issues. We're going to be coming back to you soon for a recap.
Thanks for having me, Gary. Happy to be here, and look forward to talking to you again in the future.
All right. Thanks so much.